Hello and welcome back. Today we will be discussing the Revolve tool. The Revolve tool is a tool that is found underneath our Surfaces menu. As you can see here, found underneath Surfaces, Surface drop down, Revolve. The way that the Revolve tool generates geometry is it looks at the pivot point of a curve. This curve can be a world space curve or a surface curve. The Revolve tool will look at the pivot point and allows the modeler to define a particular axis for the curve to sweep around in 360 degrees by default, generating geometry. When revolving the curve, you must make sure you pay attention to where that pivot point is located. For example, you can see that this pivot point is moved somewhat of a distance away from the end of the curve. If I were to revolve this curve right now by default without manipulating anything of the pivot point and hit apply, you can see that there is a hole in my geometry. The reason for that is the pivot point of that curve was placed somewhat of a distance away from the end of the curve, leaving an open hole in our geometry. So, to correct this problem, let's delete the geometry, select our curve, and let's move our pivot point to either end of the curve. To do this, we can hold down the hotkey, the letter D, which will allow us to manually move our pivot point. As you notice, while I'm holding down the letter D, our arrows have now disappeared, which allows us to manually move our pivot point. Once you let go of the letter D, our pivot point is now permanent. But being that we want to snap this pivot point to the either end of the curve, we also need to use our Snap to Curve tool. We can either toggle that on at the top, Snap to Curve, or we can use our hotkey, which is C, which stands for Snap to Curve. So, while holding down the letter C and the letter D, we can middle mouse click and drag on the curve until you feel it snap. Let go of C and D, and now our pivot point is permanently placed at the end of our curve. Now I'm ready to revolve. We'll revolve our curve around the y-axis, so it'll generate geometry sweeping itself 360 degrees around the y-axis. Hit revolve, and now you can see our geometry has been generated, and there's no hole in our geometry because we moved our pivot point of that curve to the end of the curve, so it generated a closed piece of geometry. Being that there is still history between our curve and our geometry, we can manipulate the components of the curve, such as the control vertex, and by manipulating these CVs while there's still history active, we can actually manipulate our geometry along with it because there is still history. This is quite useful if you're wanting to animate particular things, or it can also make it more useful for manipulating the surface without having to actually touch the surface itself. That was the Revolve tool. Thanks for joining us.